Something magical was happening in the late 1970s, early 80s. Some of the finest sci-fi films, Star Wars, Alien, Blade Runner, rekindled a love with futuristic settings and being in an environment that isn't immediately familiar to you. Come 1986, and this is eventually translated into a video game. A very special video game.
Hey Will, has anyone ever told you you're like the used car salesman of countdowns?
No, they haven't. Leave me alone. Where have you been anyway? Weren't you sort of dead or something?
How do you know I'm not still dead?
Oh, now I know why you've been away. You're just different.
You're so different now. Whatever. Metroid, you love it. I love it.
Alongside Nintendo's other giants like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, Metroid still stands as one of the most important game series of all time. It's influenced an entire genre of exploration-based games that's still thriving to this day, and numerous titles in the series have been lauded for their intelligent game design and sometimes even innovative controls. Oh, and it kicks ass too. Cannot forget the ass-kicking.
But like many great franchises, some entries have done a better job of encapsulating what it is to be a Metroid game. In fact, the formula is so open that it's hard to really pinpoint what makes games like these so enjoyable. Some people love the exploration, some people adore the feeling of impending conflict, and some people just really like shooting things. In a way, it caters to the needs of many different types of gamers, and it's perhaps why its legacy has lasted so long.
Like with the ever-classic Metroid Prime Pinball.
Yeah, kinda, but that's a pinball game. A great pinball game, but a pinball game nevertheless. Let's keep it to actual Metroid games.
So with that said, these are our top 10 Metroid games that aren't Metroid Prime Pinball.
It seems like every major Nintendo franchise has their designated black sheep. The game no one wants to talk about lest a pox befall their families or something. For Super Mario Bros. It's Hotel Mario. For Legend of Zelda it's the so-called Unholy Triforce. The Faces of Evil, The Wand of Gamelon and Zelda's Adventure. All four of which were released on the Philips CDI. But what happens when the black sheep is marketed like it's going to be the next big thing in the main series?
I've already given my feelings about Metroid Other M at length in my collab rant with Josh Scorcher, but in brief, I would agree with the general consensus that the game's quality is questionable. Since, really, whenever Metroid Other M's brought up in relation to its standing in the Metroid series, all I seem to hear about it are question after unflattering question. Why would the developers show Ridley giving Samus a PTSD relapse without establishing she has PTSD at a previous point in the game? Does Yoshio Sakamoto really think that when people are talking about Metroid being praised for its exploration, they meant looking around in pixel-perfect static search segments? Why does Samus not feel like the main character in her own game? It's a baffling product to say the least.
You can almost see what Nintendo and Team Ninja were trying to do. Clearly they felt the series needed moving forward. Maybe Metroid would benefit from a more story-driven outlook. Maybe a third-person perspective would accentuate the combat. And that's the problem with Other M. You can admire the fact that it took risks and did things very differently. You should always look to innovate wherever possible. But that doesn't mean that you can just ignore how these new additions just aren't very good. Maybe less of a black sheep, more of an outcast.
And like any outcast, what do we do if anyone asks about it?
Pretend it never happened.
And then cry about it thus far being the last game in the Metroid series to be released to date. But it will rise again one day. One day.
Would you believe it if I told you we haven't had a handheld Metroid game for 9 years now? Time sure does fly by when the most recent Metroid handheld is this DS title still riding on a wave of reputation left by the Prime series. And as long as you accept that it plays like a cut-price Prime game, Metroid Prime Hunters is actually a lot of fun. When you consider that every previous Metroid handheld was a 2D platformer, Hunters is a huge leap forward for what could be achieved when the series on a handheld. It perhaps feels more like a modern Metroid game than some of the older 2D outings.
I guess, but at the same time you could still tell it was sailing into uncharted territory.
Well, not really. The Prime game seems to do alright with that.
But those games at least had you using a proper controller, not grappling around with a DS.
While Metroid Prime Hunters is truer to the spirit of the franchise than Other M, it's worse designed in terms of gameplay and control. The game plays similarly to Kid Icarus Uprising, where you shoot with the DS's L trigger, walk with the D-pad, and aim with your right hand on the touchscreen. And as much as I love Uprising, after a while that control scheme starts to hurt my hands. And Prime Hunters has all of those exact controls, except it somehow manages to make the experience more painful by virtue of adding jumping on top of all of that. My right hand is already using my thumb and index finger to hold the stylus, so either I have to awkwardly stretch any of my other fingers on that hand to press the jump button, or tap the touchscreen twice, which kind of defeats the purpose of using the touchscreen to aim. I feel like this game was made for Octopi, and I'm pretty sure they don't have the money to buy it. Or the brains. Or maybe this comparison is stupid because the DS kind of doesn't react well to water.
Alright everyone, I'm gonna start this segment off with a little game I like to call Hands Up If You Remember Metroid 2 Return of Samus.
Metroid 2, or as it's also known as, the Metroid that time forgot. Not a bad game, or even the worst game in the series, but a game that, in the eyes of many, didn't really do a whole lot. It isn't helped by being stuck in black and white, you know, being a Game Boy brick game and all. So everything just feels more bland and repetitive, I guess. Which, when you're playing a game where you have to do quite a bit of exploring and being able to distinguish one area from another, is pretty counterintuitive. And remember all the atmospheric tunes from the first game? Now we've got a selection of steady beats, maybe rising to some sort of moody tune if something interesting happens. I know it was hard moving a formula established on the NES to a Game Boy, but it still feels like they cut a lot of corners.
Mind you, it was never going to look as good as it did on the NES. Sure, it came close, but don't forget that this was the first Metroid game on a handheld. And given the vast scale of Metroid 1, this was a staggeringly ambitious project. What makes this game even more intriguing is how it sets up so many other games in the franchise, both from a gameplay perspective but also from its story, where Samus spends the game being awesome, setting down on the Metroid home planet and destroying everything in sight. We even get to see the debut of the fabled baby Metroid that had important roles in Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion, and also that game mentioned it a few times. Might not be all there technically, but the game still carries a strong legacy. Now who wants to see that fan-made remake?
The game that started it all. Similarly to how the likes of Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Mega Man 1 all set the tone for their respective series very early on, the original Metroid wrote the recipe that inspired the rest of the games that followed. And perhaps unsurprisingly, especially given the company it was keeping at the time, it still holds up pretty capably to this day. You'd probably struggle to find a more shocking ending, at least. I mean, holy crap, Samus was in a bikini! That was the twist, right?
Metroid 1 is a huge game in almost every sense of the word. Influential, yes, but the sheer scale of this game's world should never be underestimated. At a time when game developers were struggling to make their game last longer than an afternoon, Metroid stepped up to the plate and gave gamers a complex network of tunnels and shafts to explore. Granted, they were never any more complicated than vertical scrolling or horizontal scrolling, but without a guide or any prior knowledge, Metroid could take an age to complete on your first go. The environments may look very similar, hence why it's so easy to get lost, but the first Metroid game was all about the act of exploring, rather than what it is you're exploring. A huge amount of games that don't have a linear style owe an awful lot to this one.
And as influential as Metroid was, it really wasn't an obvious game by any means. In fact, it actually kind of had me thinking outside the proverbial box for a while. It was as if to say, you mean that tiny little block of space on that wall there with no visible cracks in it can be destroyed to get my way through?
So in other words, you earned your way through Planet Zebras, whether you liked it or not. You would probably enjoy it though.
It's easy to think of Metroid Zero Mission as just a simple remake of the original NES game. Roll and slate! Hey guys, this is the Autarch, or Alex, or whatever name you want to call me, and thank you for
We aren't even done with the video yet. Your jokes are terrible.
Oh, speak for yourself, jackass.
While Zero Mission is still technically a remake, there is actually quite a bit of new ground it covered. The game's mechanics are now similar to those of Super Metroid, where once you collect a beam weapon, you keep it forever and can actively switch between them. Makes it a bit less frustrating than the original game, where you can only have one beam on you at a time, and it can be lost forever if you collect another.
Make no mistake, the Game Boy Advance was a pretty powerful machine. I mean, just to prove a point, Zero Mission included the original NES game on the same cartridge as a bonus feature. On top of this newfangled game with additional bosses, areas, and a playable epilogue where you become Solid Samus. You gotta respect a series where you can have 3 games taking place on the same planet and have them all feel like their own distinct experience. It shows just how far the series had come at that point, that a handheld title could emulate and even surpass the game that started it all. And if that isn't the sign of progress, I don't know what is.
Now can we roll the end slate?
What would happen if I said no?
Oh, I'd probably just do it anyways.
Son of a...
Hey guys, this is the Autarch, or Alex, or whatever name you want to call me, and thank you for watching. Now, since this is the real end slate video, hopefully I won't get cut off by Will this time if he's not feeling like a smarty pants. So you can check out more of our videos in the end slate. You can follow Will and I on social media, particularly Twitter. And in the meantime, I will see you for part 2, which will be on my channel. Thank you for watching once again. Take care.